Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, 70% of Americans don't have passports. That's more than a shame, says my guest today. It's potentially dangerous. A conversation with author and world traveler Pico Iyer, next on Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. My guest today has joked that he's a mongrel of Indian descent, raised in California, educated in England, and now living in Japan. Pico Iyer says he's always felt a bit of a permanent alien. But instead of seeing that as a deficit, he's used it to his advantage, making the world his home and uncovering both its everyday details and its mysteries with an outsider's eyes. His first book of essays, Video Night in Kathmandu, showed how American pop culture was taking root in some of the world's most ancient societies of the East. Other books about his travel adventures have included Falling Off the Map, Sun After Dark, and The Global Soul. His most recent book, The Open Road, is about another world traveler, the Dalai Lama. I talked with Iyer at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has been bringing some of the country's most insightful and well-known authors to Sun Valley to share their works and their views on issues of the day. I started by asking Iyer to describe how he views himself as a writer. There's this idea that the word travel writer is somehow a little bit degrading or something like that. Do you consider yourself a travel writer or a writer who happens to travel in order to ask questions about yourself and the world?
Oh, you just explained me perfectly. The second, a writer who travels, and I've always been interested in the crossing of cultures, because I'm something of a crossing of cultures myself. Indian blood, born in England, grew up in California, and live in Japan. But, for example, tourist is often regarded as a bad word, and I am a tourist all over the place, and I like being a tourist. So you're right, I don't think we need to think of travel writer or tourist as derogatory terms, because it means just somebody who's driven by curiosity and wants to take the time and trouble to go and explore other parts of the world. So I think that's a good thing.
How many countries have you been to? Do you even know? I assume every continent.
I suppose every continent. No, I have no clue. And I still have a huge list of countries I'd love to go to. And at this point in life, I probably will never see them. And I'm happy about that. I don't mind, because I've been lucky enough to see most of the countries that I'm really drawn towards.
Many of the places you've been have been extremely remote.
Yes.
And that was intentional, yes?
Yes, because I think when I travel, I want to go to a place as far as possible in every way from California, say, where I've spent a lot of time. And I want to have all my Californian assumptions turned on their heads. And so you're right, about 20 years ago, I deliberately sought out the most desolate and remote places and lonely places I could think of, whether it was Iceland or Bhutan or Paraguay, places that most sane people would never want to go to.
I've been to Iceland.
It's, yes.
And I think I'm okay. I'm pretty sane.
Yes, that's the sanest of the places I visited. One of them was North Korea, much less sane.
That would be very interesting,
yes.
Such a locked country to see.
Yes, I'd say it's the least sane place I've been.
Yes. Now, you've said the physical aspect of travel is the least interesting for you, but what really draws you is the prospect of stepping out of the daylight of everything I know into the shadows of what I don't know and may never know. So it's about the questions.
It is, because I think when we talk about being moved or being transported, we're not really talking about the physical act of getting into a Greyhound bus or an Amtrak. We're talking about something internal, which can happen actually very close to home. And yes, because I think when I'm at home, I somewhat assume that I know a lot about the world. And as soon as I'm on the road, I find I don't know a thing. And I think it's useful to be reminded of how limited and provincial you are and how little you know. And the smallest place in the world can throw back questions. I can imagine somebody living in Boise, traveling 40 miles in a certain direction and suddenly finding a planet she never imagined existed. And I think that's a very useful thing to do. I think when people think of travel, especially because I write about foreign countries a lot, they think of exotic travel. But I think the most wondrous travel can often be in your neighborhood. And nowadays, our cities are so diverse and so full of all the different continents that you can go across New York or Chicago or Los Angeles and meet Vietnam and feel you're in Ethiopia and hear people enjoying the cultures of Guatemala. So it doesn't have to involve huge travel.
On the other hand, it is really fun to go to a completely different country, and I've talked to many people who don't want to do that for whatever reason.
Yes.
Either they don't like the physical aspect of traveling, or actually more often than not, there's a fear associated with traveling, so they just don't go. Or I've heard people say, there's enough to see in my own country or in my own state, why should I go to any other country? What would you say?
Well, I think it's a great shame because, as you say, I think 70% of the people in this country don't have a passport, and even at times 50% of our legislators. And the US is the most powerful country in the world with the greatest influence. And I think it's dangerous if the country that most wants to change and govern the world is the country that's least interested in seeing and listening to other countries. So I think partly because of our responsibility across the planet, our citizens ought to visit. And also, when people do ask me about safety, and I always point out that when I began traveling in the late 80s, Washington, and there were civil wars in El Salvador, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. And Washington, D.C. had a higher murder rate than San Salvador, Beirut, or Kabul, which were in the middle of civil wars. And when I travel around the world and I tell people where I come from, to most people on the planet, the really scary place is Los Angeles or New York, and understandably so. So I think safety is in the mind of the beholder in some ways. And I remember when I first began traveling, I was spending a lot of time as a journalist in war zones in Nicaragua and Honduras and Cuba and places that sound dangerous. Nothing ever happened to me there. And I came back to my family's home in protected, comfortable Santa Barbara, and our house burnt down with me almost standing inside it. And so the worst possible thing happened in the most comfortable, affluent place. And I thought it was a very good reminder almost from the heavens that you don't know what is safe and dangerous. It's always good to take precautions, but don't assume that Afghanistan is going to be more dangerous than Santa Barbara. It often is not.
You travel alone, yes, a lot.
I mean, I think I have two great advantages that even you don't have. One is being a male, and many parts of the world I go to, I would think twice about if I were a woman, and I certainly wouldn't go alone if I were a woman. And secondly, I do have this very handy chameleon complexion. And in so many parts of the world, whether it's Cuba or the Middle East or Indonesia, I can pass as a local. And so just sort of slip into the woodwork, and nobody thinks of me as a rich or an imperialist foreigner from the United States. So I think I have it easy. And that's one reason I've traveled, because I've been blessed through no good work of my own with these two advantages.
Although I think you've written or said that since 9/11, sometimes people give you looks, you know.
In this country,
oh,
yes.
Only in this country.
Even in my local hometown airport in Santa Barbara, they're never happy to see me arrive at the airport. And I can understand why. I would look askance at me. And it's true when I go back to Japan, which is the country where I live in, they used to strip search me every time. I was exactly what they didn't want to see coming into their country. I mean, the Japanese are very gracious and hospitable and polite, as you know. But it's a very harmonious society, and somebody like me is like a dissonant instrument that's going to throw out the whole symphony that they've created. So,
how has 9/11 changed what you do, what you're able to do? Has it made travel for you as kind of tiring as it has for many other people, or do you see differences?
It's often a tiring trip, but there's exhilaration and wonder waiting at the other end. So I never get too upset if I have to put in 20 hours of discomfort for 20 days of excitement. And I don't think it's changed very much. Actually, immediately before 9/11 and right after that, I decided to start going to the Islamic countries a lot, partly because I felt that those were the ones we most needed to learn. So I've been spending a lot of time in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Jerusalem and those places. So I guess it's catalyzed me towards those countries.
Let's talk again about the questions that you ask.
Yes.
You like to ask a question of a place.
Yes.
When you go to it.
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, I know that I'll never be able to answer the question, but I know that I think it's good to travel with a plan. And even if it's a plan of finding a brooch for your neighbor or looking for a copy of Twilight in Afghanistan or something or other, once you've got a project, that allows you almost to get lost. You probably won't achieve your object, but in looking for it, you'll come upon all kinds of surprising corners that you wouldn't have thought to look for otherwise. And by asking a question, I'm making sure that I'm not just traveling idling through, and when I arrive, I'm not going to just sit in my hotel watching CNN. It moves me out into the street, and I travel to be enlightened and challenged, I suppose, and a question is one way to start that process.
So when you come to a place like Idaho,
yes,
what kind of question might you ask, or Sun Valley more specifically, if that, you know, you're here for a writers' conference, but
yes,
you also have your eyes and ears open.
Yes.
What intrigues you? What question would you ask?
One question might be having to do with the fact that I've always associated Idaho with wide open spaces and people growing up close to the land, and it's not, I don't think, one of the most affluent states. And yet I've arrived here in Sun Valley, which is a pocket of huge affluence, and people from places outside Idaho. And what exactly is going on there? What do the Idaho people feel about LA and New York flying in? Has it changed Idaho for the better or worse? I don't know. But it's certainly not a typical corner of Idaho I'm visiting. So when I go home tomorrow, I won't tell my friends I've seen Idaho. I'll say I've seen Sun Valley, which is a very specific.
Fair enough. I think people who live in Idaho would agree with you. It's a very specific part of Idaho and very different from other parts.
Yes, so. And every state does have its own character. And if I had more time here, because I have spent time in Colorado and Wyoming and Washington State, and I'd love to see what is particular to Idaho that I wouldn't find in those places. And there's a lot, I know.
You mentioned the affluence here. One of the things that happens when you travel is the reverse as well.
Yes.
You at least I, grow to appreciate even more what I do have when I travel so many times.
Yes, no, I think it's a great thing to sort of awaken one's conscience and see how little, we can do very little and it makes a huge amount of difference in other people's lives. And I always think that governments are always opposed to one another, companies are always in competition, but travelers and individuals usually are going to other places in order to make human contact. And I'm amazed at how much a typical tourist can bring to another place. And I do feel that we're living in a planetary neighborhood. And it's important to know the other parts just the way it is in your own hometown. You want to know where the poor part is, even if you don't want to spend a lot of time there. But it's good to be aware of it. And so in our planetary neighborhood, it's good to be aware of Africa or Bangladesh or Bolivia.
And back to traveling alone, you never feel alone when you're traveling by yourself, do you, because of all the people that you meet?
Quite. I mean, I'm a relatively reclusive, shy person, and I like being by myself. But you're right, when I'm traveling, I have more friends than I know what to do with. Everyone is inviting me into her home or her life or whatever, with a variety of motives, but often very generous, kind, innocent motives.
Isn't that the way you met your wife? Too, in Japan,
not exactly. I met a lot of marriage proposals from people who want to leave their countries. In Japan, I met my wife my third week in Japan at a temple ceremony.
Right, but she came up to you, right?
She did, and she did, and she was, I think, fascinated with any foreigner. So she wanted to know who my favorite American rock star was and what I thought of England and California. So yes,
and then she kept inviting you.
She did.
Over. It's a great story. It's in the book, The Lady and the Monk.
The Lady and the Monk, exactly.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And I think many of us forget that as soon as we travel abroad to an exotic place, we become the exotic ones, and we are the symbol of where we suddenly become glamorous millionaires to the people we visit, and that brings its own challenges, but it's an interesting aspect.
And it's interesting that you felt an affinity for Japan since you were a small child, and I have felt an affinity for Iran, and I eventually went to go visit there, and who knows why we have these affinities for countries that we obviously weren't born in, but we're drawn to.
And it's a beauty of the modern moment that you and I, if we can save up the time and money, can actually visit the places of our dreams. Because maybe 50 years ago, you would have been sitting at home looking at pictures of Iran, and I would have been sitting in California reading poems of Japan, but we never could really experience them firsthand. And I think, sometimes I think to myself, well, all these things I can do that my grandparents could never have done, such as see the country of my dreams, well, it would be a crime not to make the best of that opportunity.
Now, some people are only doing that. They're only looking on the internet at various travel films, or they're looking at television, and they never actually go to the place.
Yes. And as you know, because you've traveled so much, there's no substitute for first-hand experience. In fact, the more internet images of Iran there are in the world, the more important it is for us to see the real Iran and to look past the screens, because in my experience, images are a good first portal, but they cannot begin to convey the full humanity and the reality of most places.
Now, you mentioned one tip for traveling, which is maybe go try and pick up a present for somebody or something that they want, and make sure not to go into the hotel and first thing turn on the television and all the things that remind you of back home. Let's talk about some other tips that you have, because I think they're very interesting. One is to take in a performance or a sporting event. I know when I went to Argentina, I'm not interested in polo, but I went to see a polo match because, that's the thing.
Yes.
And it was really interesting. So find some sort of cultural event to go to.
Yes, exactly. Even when I first went to Japan, I decided to go and see baseball games because I thought that's the one thing I could follow even without speaking Japanese language. And of course, they take this all-American pastime and they make it completely Japanese. And I learned much more about Japan just watching a ball game, which was also fun, of course.
Another thing which I've done just even in the United States is ride a bus to the end of the line.
Yes.
You know, you learn a lot, don't you?
You do. And again, it's an easier thing to do if you're male. And
you know, I guess I'll take issue with you in one respect. When I was in Iran, as a woman, I had access to interviewing both women and men as a woman, whereas if you had tried to interview a woman, you would not have been able to without the permission of a man or a man in the room. So in some instances, being a woman is helpful.
That's perfect.
I understand, though, because I actually have been, you know, in Argentina actually was followed by somebody and who was trying to rob me. So I know it's both sides of the coin. Being a woman traveling, but I guess I would not discourage women from traveling, thinking that there's some sort of danger.
Especially if
inherent.
People are so kind and so protective. I travel a lot with my mother, who's 79 now, and luckily she's a mother who wants to go to interesting places. So I've gone with her to Cambodia and Syria and Easter Island and Jordan and she was recently in Peru and I think she knows, especially as a 79-year-old woman, that if she weren't with me and she were by herself, everyone in every country would cluster around to protect her and help her and take her in. And so actually, as you say, she would be the beneficiary of the kindness that you meet around the world. And I think what you just said is also a perfect illustration. When you went to Iran, I'm suspecting you thought of some of the things that you could do that many people couldn't, such as I couldn't, and you did them. I mean, I think it's always good to try to see what special keys we possess that will open doors that not everybody has.
And so when somebody wants to write, be a travel writer, you encourage them to think about, you know, what can they bring specifically to a topic, because everybody's out there trying to be a travel writer. Another tip you have is to get lost, and I've done that too, and it's fun for me. I mean, not so lost at night that it becomes a danger issue, but just to get lost and see what you find.
And luckily, it's very easy. It's almost impossible not to get lost in my experience. So yes, good things will always come. And I think that's really a way of saying, I always make a strict plan before I go, and then I know as soon as I arrive, the plan will go out the window, and that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah, if you have a plan and at least a map, you know, then you can do a lot. And you really encourage people to take a lot of notes, particularly when they first arrive at a place, those first impressions.
I think that's mostly for people who want to write about that. But I actually would recommend to anyone to keep a journal, yes, because I think it's a much more inner and emotional and profound record of your experience than anything you could get with a digicam or a tape recorder or anything else.
Well, when people are taking so many photographs, and I find myself doing this too sometimes, just snapping away. Do you think they're losing some of the experience by trying to record so much of it instead of just be in it?
I do think so. I used to travel with a camera and I don't now for that reason, because I found I was always looking for the right image and not actually taking in the whole place in all its chaos as I would otherwise. So I think the fewer filters between us and the place, the better. I always think of places as people, and when I meet a person, I want to be talking to her just as I am with you, not trying to photograph you or take notes about you, but just to encounter you.
Now, one tip you have that I found interesting was to go to McDonald's sometimes in different countries.
Yes, because every country translates McDonald's into a local thing. When I go to my McDonald's in Japan, where I live, most people are wearing Armani and Dior. They're eating moon-viewing burgers during the time of the harvest moon in September. And everything about the way they speak and don't speak is completely Japanese. I know I'm not in Kansas anymore. I go into McDonald's in my parents' homeland, India. Most people there are vegetarian. There's a strong smell of spiced cardamom tea. The main items on the menu are pizzas. Then I'll go into McDonald's in Bolivia, and McDonald's is such a status symbol there. There are security guards armed at the door. There are Seiko watches in display cases. The prices are higher than in a chic French cafe next door. And each McDonald's is completely different because every culture takes this American thing and makes it its own.
Fascinating. Now, how do you keep up your strength traveling? Do you have any tips for, you know, staying healthy and dealing with jet lag?
No, I've been lucky in that way. I think for my Indian parents, I got a cast iron stomach, which has helped me. Jet lag permanently afflicts me, and I never do anything except I assume I'm going to be jet lagged for the first 7 days after a transoceanic flight. And so I try to put it to use. And so I walk around all night and I see corners of London or Paris or Tokyo I'd never see in the daytime. And I decide, well, no point fighting against it. Let's work with it. And you know, it's true, I don't drink the water, and I clean my teeth with bottled water. I don't eat fruit, and I take lots of precautions in terms of my food, which is why McDonald's can be such a godsend. I can just eat French fries. So I think take sensible precautions, but at some level you're at the hands of
You just
the
know
fates.
you're going to be tired when you're traveling. That's part of it, usually.
Yes, yes, and so be open to being up, as I often am, from 11 p.m. to 11 a.m., sleeping through the afternoon, and then being awake all night. And it tilts the world in a different way than you usually see it, and you get the benefit of that.
Now, someone who travels extensively, you've just written about, and that's the Dalai Lama.
Yes,
He is a global figure,
yes,
which is kind of interesting because he's also a monk, so you would
Yes.
think that he would be solitary, but in order to get his message out, he's had to travel. And you've had the interesting opportunity to know him off and on since you were a teenager, because
Yes.
your father, who was a professor or philosopher,
That's right, exactly.
visited him quite early on before he was well known, and took you with him.
Yes,
And so you've written this book, which is very interesting, and what comes out of it for me is the humanity of this individual. He does not consider himself a god. In fact, he discourages that thought, and that indeed he doesn't even know if there'll be another Dalai Lama after him.
yes. No, that's beautifully said. And I think it's very important to him to stress his humanity, because he always says that if you meet him, and I know he came to this area, in fact, a couple of years ago, and if you're impressed by his kindness or his attentiveness or his clear-sightedness, that's just a reflection of what you are and you can be. And he always stresses, I'm exactly the same as you. I'm prey to the same sorrows and challenges and confusions, and yet if you're moved by my example, that's actually just a reflection of your example.
He has a very interesting sense of humor. For instance, here in Sun Valley, when he came, there were some white scarves given out and some bracelets, and it turned out that they were made in China. and people were just kind of, oh,
Yes.
oh. Well, he got up on stage and he hit it head on, and he, you know, held up the scarf, and he said, I'm sure some of you are wondering, and he said, perhaps the person who made this in China will, you know, learn something more about
Yes.
Tibet by having made this for the, I mean, he turned it into kind of a positive instead of a
Yes.
negative, and he had a laugh with it.
Yes. I think that's the story of his life, and that's one of the messages he has to offer any of us, whether we're Christian or Islamic or atheist or Buddhist, which is that almost any situation you can see as a frustration or as an opportunity. But if you see it as an opportunity, you'll be much happier. And as I was saying about the travel with jet lag, rather than seeing it as an obstruction, see it as a possibility.
Now, he takes what's called the middle way,
Yes.
and has with,
Yes.
with China, and he's not belligerent.
No.
And China is increasing its presence in Tibet.
Yes.
And so some people are getting frustrated that
Yes.
not enough is being done to, I guess there's a difference between free Tibet and save Tibet,
Right.
but to work on that issue. They're frustrated with what they see as maybe passivity on his part.
Yes, exactly. He's seeing things in the long term, and I think he's a realist more than anything. And he knows that if any Tibetans do the smallest act of provocation or confrontation to Beijing, they'll bring so much more suffering on Tibetans and on Chinese, who've suffered so much already. He's outnumbered by 200 to 1. He knows that Tibet and China are always going to be neighbors, and it never makes sense to antagonize your neighbor. If you're always going to be living right next to a person for 500 years, don't make even if they're acting badly towards you, you've got to.
So he doesn't necessarily want Tibet to be its own country. He wants it to be autonomous within
Yes.
China. Do you think that'll happen eventually?
I think a resolution will come, and I think as more and more of the Chinese leaders become aware of the rest of the world, and that many of them are now educated in the West, they'll become more global in their thinking, and I think it will happen. Because China has everything to gain. They have nothing to fear from Tibet, and they have a lot to gain in PR terms from just loosening the pressures a little bit.
Nevertheless, you have said that this is the most dark and difficult period of all for Tibet.
Yes, he's been saying that a lot. And I think one thing he always stresses is that if Tibet is a part of China, it really behooves China to protect Tibet with its life and to protect Tibetan culture and Tibetan religion and Tibetan language, because they are adornments of China now. I sometimes think it's a little bit analogous to our controlling Hawaii, and we're so proud to have Hawaii as part of the United States. And the reason we like Hawaii is it has its own customs and its own language. And so if we just turned Hawaii into another version of Nebraska, everybody would lose. We've got to sustain Hawaiian culture, partly because it's American culture now.
And he, interestingly, wants people to go to Tibet. I would think he would want boycott, going there. But he wants people to go and experience it, and I guess maybe see the oppression firsthand, in his view?
Yes, and just tell us what's happening, because it's very closed, and I think one of the difficult things for him is that he can't go and inspect it firsthand. China is controlling most of the media, and so we don't get any objective reports. And you're right, he always says, don't listen to my propaganda, but don't listen to Chinese propaganda, just go and see for yourself, and then tell us honestly what you see. And he says, if you come back and tell us that the Tibetans are happy, we'll be very happy, and then we'll never say another bad thing about the situation.
You ended up liking him very much, it seems, from the book.
Yes, I've known him for a long time, as you said, and I thought if I spend 5 years researching him, maybe I'll think less of him. But after 5 years, I think much more highly of him, and I really respect. I think he has one of the most difficult lives in the world, and he handles it with such equanimity and good humor. It's quite inspiring to watch.
Now, as much as you travel, when you're at home, and I think you live in both Japan and California,
yes,
right?
Yes, that's right.
But for many years, you lived without the internet, without a car. I think you still don't have a cell phone, right?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
You lived a pretty ascetic life and continue to do that sometimes by going to live in a monastery.
Yes.
Why is that important for you?
Well, actually, what may seem ascetic to some people seems really luxurious to me. And so, indeed, where I live in Japan is just a 2-room apartment. As you say, no bicycle, no car, no high-speed internet, no TV, no media.
But you have the internet. Just not high speed?
Yes, that's right. I do email, but I've barely been beyond email. And what it means is every day lasts for 1,000 hours, it seems. From the time I wake up to the time I sleep, it feels as if I have time to do everything. I can write for 4 or 5 hours, I can read books, I can take walks, I can do my emails, take care of my business, and I still have time left over. And to me, it seems like a very indulgent life, almost. I feel very lucky to have that. And I've noticed, in my own case, everybody's different, but the fewer things I have, the freer and happier I become.
What will we see from you next? What are you working on? A book about Graham Greene, right?
Yes, which is similar to, I suppose, a book about the Dalai Lama, because I think both of them face this interesting question of how do we live a life of clarity and kindness and conscience in the middle of our confused everyday world? And I think that's a good question to ask oneself.
And when will that book be out?
I'm hoping spring of 2012, so I've just about finished it, and the publishers usually take about 15 months to get it into the hands of the public.
Well, we'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, it's been a real delight. Thank you.
That was author Pico Iyer. I spoke with him at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. I'd like to thank him and the organizers of the conference for finding time in his schedule for this interview. If you'd like to watch this conversation again, or you'd like to watch my interviews from 4 other seasons of the Sun Valley series, please check out the Dialogue website. That's also where you'll find more information on the authors and the conference. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho. To order a copy of this program from Idaho Public Television, call our toll-free number or visit us on the World Wide Web.